Why most advice sounds good but changes nothing. Why does so much financial advice sound smart, but leave your life exactly the same? Most people don't lack advice. They lack change. You can scroll for 5 minutes and hear dozens of good ideas. Save more. Invest early. Build multiple income streams. Think long term. Stop wasting money. None of it sounds wrong. In fact, most of it sounds responsible, sensible, even motivating. And yet, months pass, years pass. Income might increase slightly, stress changes shape. But the feeling of being stuck doesn't disappear. That gap between knowing what sounds right and seeing real movement is where frustration quietly builds. You start wondering if you're doing something wrong. Or worse, if progress is only possible for people with better timing, more luck, or fewer responsibilities. The uncomfortable truth is this. Most advice doesn't fail because it's incorrect. It fails because it doesn't change how people actually decide. And until that difference is understood, advice will keep sounding good, while nothing really changes. Most people don't realize they're surrounded by advice that sounds helpful but leaves their financial life unchanged. In fact, the average working professional hears more guidance about money, careers, and investing today than any generation before. Save more, invest early, build passive income, think long term, avoid bad debt. On the surface, none of this sounds wrong. It sounds sensible, even obvious. Yet for a large number of people in the US and the UK, financial reality tells a different story. They follow the advice they can. They try to be responsible. They budget, contribute to retirement accounts, maybe invest on the side. Their income may rise slowly over time. And still, life doesn't feel meaningfully different. Pressure remains. Time feels scarce. The sense of being almost there never goes away. This is why the problem matters. It's not that advice is unavailable. It's that advice rarely translates into movement. People don't feel stuck because they lack information. They feel stuck because nothing they hear seems to change how their life actually operates day to day. Most advice addresses outcomes, not conditions. It assumes people have room to act freely, when in reality many are operating under tight constraints. Jobs demand availability. Bills demand consistency. Responsibilities demand reliability. Advice that ignores these realities feels disconnected, even when it's logically correct. As a result, advice becomes something people agree with instead of something they act on. It creates momentary clarity without lasting impact. Over time, this gap breeds quiet frustration. People start questioning themselves, not the advice. They wonder why progress feels so slow despite doing the right things. Recognizing this gap is essential, because without it, people keep consuming more advice while staying in the same place. And that cycle can last for years without anyone noticing why nothing is really changing. The reason most advice changes nothing isn't because it's wrong. It's because it's built on assumptions that don't match how people actually live. Most financial and career advice assumes excess capacity, extra time, extra energy, extra mental space. In reality, most working adults operate near their limit. They're managing jobs, bills, families, and expectations all at once. Advice that ignores this reality may sound smart, but it isn't usable. Another root issue is that advice is usually abstract, while life is concrete. Telling someone to invest long term or increase income streams skips over the messy middle, the uncertainty, the trade-offs, and the risk of making life harder before it gets better. Because those costs are immediate and visible, while the benefits are delayed and uncertain. The brain naturally resists action. Advice loses the moment it asks people to tolerate discomfort without clear short-term reward. There's also a deeper psychological factor at play. Good-sounding advice creates a sense of progress without requiring change. Listening, agreeing, and nodding feels productive. It relieves anxiety temporarily, even if nothing in daily life shifts. This is why people consume advice repeatedly while staying in the same financial position. The advice soothes the problem instead of solving it. Finally, most advice focuses on individual behavior while ignoring structure. It talks about discipline, motivation, and mindset, but not about dependency, fixed costs, or how income is tied to time. Without addressing structure, effort just reinforces the same system. People work harder, optimize small decisions, and stay busy, but nothing fundamental changes. That's the hidden reason advice fails. It speaks to intention, not position, and until that gap is addressed, even the best advice will continue to sound right while changing very little. If most advice fails because it ignores real life, then real progress has to start somewhere different. Not with motivation, not with more information, but with how decisions fit into the structure of someone's actual day-to-day reality. The shift that creates change is moving from advice that demands transformation to actions that reduce friction. Instead of asking, "What should I be doing ideally?" the better question is, "What small adjustment would make my current system less fragile?" This reframing matters because it respects limits instead of fighting them. Real progress rarely begins with dramatic moves. It begins with decisions that slightly lower pressure. Building a small financial buffer that reduces urgency. Redirecting a portion of income before it gets absorbed into spending. Learning a skill that increases leverage without requiring a full career reset. These actions don't feel impressive, and that's why they're often overlooked. But they change the conditions under which future decisions are made. Another key difference is focusing on position instead of behavior. Behavior is what you do. Position is what happens if you stop. If missing one paycheck creates panic, no amount of good habits will feel secure. Progress starts when effort is used to reduce dependence on constant output, not just to maintain it. That might mean lowering fixed costs, diversifying income sources slowly, or creating time flexibility before chasing higher pay. This approach also changes how advice is evaluated. Instead of asking whether something sounds smart, the question becomes whether it makes life lighter over time. Does it reduce future pressure? Or just add another obligation? Does it expand options, or lock them in earlier? The reason this works is simple. Change doesn't require intensity, it requires alignment. When actions fit the reality of someone's life, they get repeated, and when small, repeatable actions are applied consistently, they quietly reshape outcomes. That's when advice stops being motivational and starts becoming practical. The real impact of following advice that feels good but changes nothing doesn't show up immediately. That delay is exactly why it's so dangerous. In the short term, life looks the same. You still work, you still earn, you still handle responsibilities. From the outside, everything appears stable enough to continue. But over time, the cost becomes structural. When advice doesn't translate into action, patterns remain unchanged, income rises, but so do commitments. Time fills up with obligations that can't easily be adjusted. Financial decisions become reactive because there's no margin to absorb disruption. Life doesn't collapse, it tightens. And tightening is much harder to notice than failure. This is how people end up feeling confused rather than defeated years later. On paper, they did everything they were told. They worked hard. They stayed responsible. They followed sensible advice. Yet flexibility feels limited. Career changes feel risky. Even slowing down feels uncomfortable. Because everything depends on momentum continuing. By contrast, when advice leads to even small structural changes early, the long-term experience looks very different. Progress may feel slower at first. There's less visible validation and fewer dramatic milestones. But pressure compounds in the opposite direction. Decisions feel lighter. Unexpected costs feel manageable. Time begins to feel like something that can be allocated, not something constantly sold. This is where time becomes the deciding factor. Consistency matters more than intensity. A few aligned decisions repeated quietly over years reshape what's possible far more than bursts of motivation ever could. Not because they're exciting, but because they change the rules of the game. Most advice fails because it aims to inspire. What actually works is advice that changes structure. And the difference between the two isn't visible in a week or a month, it shows up years later. In how free or constrained life feels. That's the consequence. Most people never connect back to the advice they once thought was good enough. Most people don't lack information. They lack awareness of what information is actually changing. Advice that sounds good but changes nothing isn't useless because it's wrong. It fails because it never forces a shift in how decisions are made. It comforts instead of confronting. It reassures instead of restructuring. And as long as life feels manageable, that kind of advice feels good enough. But over time, good enough advice produces good enough results. Stable, but tight. Responsible, but fragile. Busy, but not free. Real progress doesn't come from collecting better tips or hearing smarter ideas. It comes from noticing patterns early, before they harden into constraints. From asking quieter, more uncomfortable questions about where your effort is actually leading. From paying attention to what advice encourages you to feel, and what it requires you to change. This isn't about becoming extreme, rejecting all guidance, or trying to outsmart the system. It's about recognizing that advice only matters when it alters behavior, structure, or direction, not just mindset. Inspiration fades quickly, structure lasts. The people who gain real financial control don't usually feel confident when they start. They feel uncertain. They question routines that once felt safe. They notice when staying busy is no longer the same as moving forward. And they accept that progress often feels quieter and less reassuring before it becomes visible. Money doesn't respond to how motivated you feel. It responds to what you consistently do differently. So instead of asking whether advice sounds smart, a more useful question might be this. Does this change how my future will function, or does it simply make the present feel easier to accept? And maybe the most important question of all. What's one piece of advice you've agreed with for years, but never actually applied in a way that changed anything? If you're honest, that answer usually reveals far more than the advice itself.